Usher here. It's still winter as I film this video, as you can see outside my window, but I'm going to try to bring a little springtime into the kitchen today with this mini botanical series of cookies using royal icing transfers. I've also recently become enamored with contoured royal icing transfers. I think you first saw them way back when I did curvy snakes with my Halloween cauldron, and more recently when I did the curved holly leaves with my candelabra cookie. But I love the challenge of trying to coax otherwise intractable royal icing into curvy, complex shapes. So you'll see me throughout this video and this series doing exactly that with the shaping and making of royal icing leaves and petals. Snowdrops are one of the first signs of spring, at least on the East Coast where I grew up. They seem an appropriate place to start with this series. I'll be recreating these cookies you see in the foreground and scrolling overhead. They include not only royal icing transfers for the flowers and leaves, but also a molded cookie to make a very lifelike flower bulb. Let's talk about what we'll need for this project. You'll want 2 iced cookies that are kind of irregular in form. You could use a more regularly shaped cookie, but I wanted to mimic something that might look like a weather-worn garden catalog page or a botanical print. So I actually tore the cookie dough to create this kind of effect, and I'll show that in a bit. We will be stamping on it to create a subtle background effect. So we will be covering the rubber stamping effect, which I've covered in other videos. To do that, you'll need various botanical rubber stamps. You'll want a felt ink pad for applying the food coloring. I'm using brown liquid gel food coloring for the stamping. And once it's stamped, we're going to color it. We're going to be airbrushing the edges as well as using compressed petal dust to add subtle color to some of the stamps. Again, just to lend a little bit of interest. We don't want the background to be too busy because the showpiece here really are the dimensional royal icing flowers that go on top. Let me talk first about what's used to create the flower bulb at the bottom. I will say always, it's good to have real examples of the things you're trying to create. These are not snowdrop bulbs, these are actually daffodil bulbs, but the shape is nearly identical and the look and feel. So this is a good example to have in front of you. I often also print out photographs of the actual plant and really study them if I don't have them available at the appropriate time of year. Now to create that bulb, you'll need a teaspoon. This is actually a ½ teaspoon measure into which we're going to mold the cookie dough to create a bulb-like form. And of course, you'll need some cookie dough, ideally a non-spreading type. We'll be working with my gingerbread. We want to put some skins on those bulbs after we dip them in royal icing. So you need some royal icing for this project. I don't have that all out here, but you'll be using an ivory color for dipping the bulbs and various green shades and white shades for the flowers. Once it's dipped and dry though, we're going to add some skins with wafer paper, which we're going to draw some lines on to mimic the lines on actual bulb skins. We're going to shape them with a little Faber liquid. We're going to airbrush them, and then we're ultimately going to wrap them and stick them onto the cookie bulb with a little bit of corn syrup. And lastly, we need some emerging roots from that bulb, and for that I'm using corn silk, which is edible. So you'll see some of those bulb pieces in various stages of completion, and we'll get into this in more detail as we go along. But here they are undipped, here they are dipped, and here are some that are fully formed with skins and roots. Now onto the flower portion, the snowdrops, which will end up looking something like this when they're fully shaped. They're comprised of anywhere from, I'd say, 4 to 6 petals a piece, 5 to 7 petals a piece. There are various configurations you can do them in, but each petal needs at least 2 inner petals, sometimes 3, that have a little green edge to them, but are otherwise white. And each needs at least 4 outer petals. These are all white and about twice as long as the inner petals. And we'll get into all the detailed shaping of that. This is what I mean by curved royal icing transfer or contoured royal icing transfer. It's not flat, it's quite curvy. That's going to give that snowdrop a really lifelike look. I have some other curvy shapes too that are made much the same way as the flower petals, and they are leaves of various shapes. We've got long curvy leaves, which are the snowdrop leaves. We've got them in smaller sizes here. Here they are airbrushed. I've got some other miscellaneous leaves that I'm just going to use as filler. I'll just demonstrate the snowdrop leaves because the technique is basically the same. Now these are the stems of the snowdrops, very, very fragile. Because these are so fragile, they are shaped in a different way. They're going to be shaped with a little bit of parchment paper on a flat surface. If I do them on acetate, they're sometimes more difficult to get off the acetate. Now, in addition, we want to colorize all of these things. You'll notice the leaves are quite pale. I like to apply coloring later to give them a little more depth and dimension, and I do that typically through airbrushing. So we'll be airbrushing these in shades of green with a little bit of brown accent on it, so some of the edges look a little more weathered. So let's move on and talk about how I created these fun torn shapes and also the molded bulbs, because those two elements of the cookie are a little bit different than usual. So let's shape some unusual pieces. The fun thing about this cookie is it's very forgiving. There's no right or wrong shape, so you can do just about anything you want. And I've got just 5 examples here, ranging from small to pretty darn big, ranging from pretty regular edges to very irregular edges. I would say though, typically with this project, I'm working with a cookie that's at least 4 to 5 inches long, because the snowdrop's going to be pretty long. They're naturally a long, stately flower. So I want to give enough room for most of the snowdrop to be on the cookie. Some can be overhanging. So I'm probably leaning towards something more in this size as opposed to this size. This starts getting a little big. Now to create that shape, it's really straightforward. I'm using my gingerbread dough because I'm going to be airbrushing the edges, and I don't like the airbrush showing up on a light cookie. Plus I think it looks more organic to be using a dark dough. It doesn't need to be gingerbread. It could be chocolate dough or tinted sugar cookie dough. So you just want to roll it to your normal thickness. This dough's been rolled a few times, so it's a little bit stiff relative to my normal working consistency. And then you're just that's a nice shape as it is, but it's kind of big, so you can tear it down to size. It's easiest to take off a smaller amount as opposed to a larger amount. And I'm just using the ruler here as a rough guide to size it. And because this is going to be a pretty big piece, it's best to roll directly on a silicone mat or a piece of parchment paper and then transfer the whole thing to the oven, as opposed to shaping it and then having to lift it and move it, and you'll really distort it. Though here, a little distortion isn't going to be the end of the world. And then that's ready to go into the oven. I just simply lift it up and into the oven it goes. As I mentioned in the intro, I actually had some real daffodil bulbs hanging around, but I also printed out this image of snowdrops to get a sense of the whole structure from bulb to top. So I thought one way to create that shape was simply to mold them in metal teaspoons into something. This is going to go in the oven, so whatever you're molding it in has to be oven proof. Here's one small one baked in a 1/2 teaspoon mold. And you could go a little bit bigger, but remember, these are going to be dips, so they're going to gain a little bit of girth once I dip them in royal icing, and I'm then going to wrap them with wafer paper, so they're going to get even fatter. I'm finding that this 1/2 teaspoon measure, which is about 7/8 of an inch across, is a pretty good size for this project. And that's what generated this. So to create that, take off a little blob. You don't want it any bigger than the teaspoon, because it is going to expand a little bit in the oven. So just roll it into a ball. If it's too much bigger, it's going to expand over the edge and you're going to get a little lip on it. Kind of like I got on this one. This had a lot of flour on it too. You don't want that much flour. So it's got a little cap on it where it intersected the edge of the teaspoon. So you don't want it to be any fatter than this. And then I just put a little peak on it, kind of pinch it at the top. I'd bake this as I normally would, just put it on a silicone mat and put it in the oven. It'll probably pop right out. If it doesn't the first time through, then lightly flour the inside of the teaspoon. And when it comes out, you don't want it to cool down in here because then it might stick. You want to make sure you can move it right away so it comes out easily. Here are some other little shapes I made. These are supposed to look like the little parts of the bulb that kind of peel off a bulb sometimes. Sometimes there are 2 parts to a bulb. So here I simply took a little dough and molded it into kind of a teardrop shape and then baked it over the back side of a smaller version of this. So I may or may not use these, but the concept's the same. For the big entire bulbs, I'm baking them inside. For these smaller shapes, I'm forming them and shaping them over the outside. That's all there is to it. I've got all the stuff I need now to start the petals, and we're going to start with the outer petal of the Snowdrop, which is about 3/4 inch in length and is sort of this rounded diamond shape, if you will. And I devised this template by looking at actual images, as I said, and this is sort of where we're headed. I'm working on these outer petals right now up here. So what I've drawn here is the basic shape. We're going to be capturing all of that with royal icing. I'm going to just lay a little bit of acetate over it. Let me move these guys out of the way so I don't break them, because you want to have ready what you're going to be shaping this little bit of royal icing over. So I've got 2 tubes. They're taped onto something so that when I'm done with this piece, I can move it out of the way very easily. And I have 2 size tubes. I'll have the dimensions in the video description. I want more arc to the outer petals because they're going on the outside, and I want them to look particularly curvy and to kind of encapsulate the smaller petals on the inside. So to do that, I'm going to use the tube of lesser diameter. When I get to the inside petals, I need them to be a little bit straighter and less contoured so I can fit the outer petals around them. So I'm going to go slightly wider on those. I find it's best to work on 1 petal at a time because we're shaping these. If you do a bunch, pipe them all out flat and then try to wrap them, by the time you wrap them, the first petal might have dried slightly and you might get some cracking on it. So I tend to work 1 at a time, just a small slip of acetate, enough to cover 1 petal. This one's covering 3, but I'm only going to do 1. I've got royal icing here of a relatively thick flooding consistency because I want these to have some body. So you want to make sure that you've got a trussing needle handy because if it's really thick, you might have some peaks that you need to knock out. I think I am going to just tape this acetate down on one side just so that doesn't shift as I'm piping. And I'm going to remove some tape, have some little segments ready to go because I'm going to need to wrap it and tape it down onto the tube almost immediately. And if I have to do that while the icing is in my hands, it gets a little tricky. Okay, starting first with the larger outer petal. This is a basic outlining and flooding process using my trussing needle to get the icing into those tight corners. Now while the icing is still wet, I want to wrap it around the smaller tube so it has more arc. And you want to make sure you're holding down that acetate as you tape it because if the acetate flips up, you could crack the icing if it's begun to set. I'm piping on acetate because it leaves a nice shiny underside to the petal, which I really like in this construction. Onto the smaller petal, same outlining and flooding process, except I'm hitting it with a little green icing at the bottom to mimic a real snowdrop. Now that particular petal is going to be wrapped around the larger tube so it has a more gentle curve, as you can see here. So of course you'd fill out the entire tube if you're making multiple flowers. You typically need 2 to 3 of the inner petals for each flower and 3 to 4 of the outer petals. Set those aside, ideally overnight. So to remove the petals, this holds true for the big ones and the small ones, you want to do it over a soft surface so that if they should flip off uncontrollably, they don't break. Hold down that acetate from both sides as you're untaping it, again, so the acetate doesn't flip off uncontrollably. Now, to pull off the acetate, I'd like to pull it away from the ends that are going to be most exposed in the final construction. If I pull the other way, I run the risk of breaking the ends that are going to be most visible. So I'm pulling away towards the top of the flower in this case, as opposed to towards the bottom, which will be most visible. Bottom side here is quite shiny, as you can see, and again, that's because I piped on acetate as opposed to parchment paper. So let's talk about how to put these together in little florets. Here's a simple 2x2 version, meaning there are 2 petals on either side of the outside and then 2 petals on the inside, but there are lots of other possible configurations. Here, for instance, is a bigger one that has 2 petals on either side but 3 on the inside. I'm going to construct a simple 2x2 one. You want to do this on acetate because we're going to actually be gluing the petals together in halves, and if you were to glue directly onto cardboard, you'd never get it off. I'm gluing here with thick royal icing glue, white of course, putting down the 1 inner petal, and then I'm going to straddle it with 2 outer petals. And I'm going to repeat that 1 more time. Again, putting down the inner petal and then straddling it with 2 outer petals to create the back side. And once those 2 halves are dry, I'll then simply piece them together with a little bit more royal icing. So let's get that left petal on. I want to get it roughly centered because I need to fit a right petal on to the right side. Less is more as far as the icing glue. You don't want it to show, so I'm using very, very little. Okay, so that's nicely configured. and I'm going to set it aside to dry. The first one a day later is now completely dry, so I'm going to invert it very carefully, put a little icing at the top, and then pick up the other dried half and simply drop it into place. I can use my trussing needle to manipulate the position ever so slightly. That again would have to dry completely before we move on to the next step. Once these are completely dry and assembled is to attach the little stemlet you see at the top. And this is an important piece because that's what's going to connect to the longer stem. We're actually just going to ease it up next to the long stem when we put it on the cookie. We're not actually going to glue them together. So it needs to be long enough to engage with some piece that might be somewhat a distance from it. So it'll be about 1/4 of an inch in length. But before I do that to those pieces I put together, I did want to point out I sometimes additionally shade the inside of the inner petal darker green by airbrushing it, holding it up like this, and then lightly airbrushing it with a dark green. And that gives a more graduated tone from light green to dark green, which is very characteristic of what you see on snowdrops. On the ones I put together, I did not do that. On airbrush, they look like that. You can go either way. This lends more realism, but is a little more time consuming. Now to pipe these stemlets on, I want to use a relatively thick icing that holds its shape, but not so thick that it pipes rough looking. You want it to look smooth. I don't want to secure this piece to pipe this, so this is going to drag a little bit, but that's going to elongate the stemlet, and that's kind of what I want. Now if the floret should move too much on you as you're applying pressure here, you can prop it with a pastry tip, but apply pressure and then pull back rather abruptly. I'm using a number 5 tip, and then lift up the end of the floret. You don't want it hitting the table, you want it to be relatively horizontal. Now moving on to the long snowdrop leaves, these shapes were again drawn by tracing over the picture I showed you earlier. They're going to start plain and then we're going to airbrush them to give them color. Laying acetate though on top of my tracing, I'm just going to simply outline and flood just as I did with the petals. Again, starting with a light color because we're going to be adding the darker shades when we airbrush. Flooding here, again with a relatively thick flooding consistency icing so that the leaves have some body, and using my trussing needle to coax that icing into the tighter spots. Then it's a wrapping process just as before, but we've got a lot more flexibility. I can wrap over the narrow tube or the broad tube. I can wrap it lengthwise or completely crosswise as I was doing earlier, and I like to do this in many different ways so I have a lot of leaves to choose from later. Here are some that are wrapped on the diagonal that have dried. I'm ready to remove them, again holding down the tape on either end so the acetate doesn't flip off. And once it's fully off, I'll roll the piece forward. In this case, it is peeling off of its own accord, so I don't have to worry much about peeling it off the acetate. And you'll notice how nice and shiny again it is on the backside. Now we're going to work on the piece here that attaches to the floret that we did first. And you'll notice it's got this top arc and a smaller arc inside that attaches to the floret. So to do that, I'm again going to be working on acetate. It's going to start looking like this piece here in light green. And once it's airbrushed, it's going to look darker and also have some lighter tones on it, which will just give it a little bit more realism. For this, I'm using a relatively thick royal icing, and I'm going to be working on parchment paper this time because this is a long, slender piece. I don't want to struggle getting it off acetate, and royal icing will always stick to acetate a little bit more than parchment paper. So I'm going to work on parchment paper so that parchment paper doesn't buckle. I've got it secured to the cardboard underneath with shortening all the way around. It has a tendency to buckle as the icing dries, and that can crack the transfer. But we're ready to pipe, as I'm doing here, and I'm using a number 4 tip and a relatively thick icing so it holds its shape. That piece had an air bubble in the middle, perhaps because I was piping too fast. It pulled apart. So I'm going to pipe a little more slowly, give it a gentle arc, and that's the primary part of the stem. We're going to do a number of those, as many as fit on the parchment paper, and again, set them aside to dry. But before they dry, we need to add that arc piece that comes over the top of the stem and hangs over the flower. And to do that, I'm using a 101S tip by Wilton, holding the narrow end up and dragging it to a point, breaking it rather abruptly at the end so it comes to a point. Now the connection point here is rather clunky, so I'm going to take a damp paintbrush and gently paint it, or brush it if you will, into the stem to smooth that transition point. And that looks great. Now we're on to the molded cookie bulbs now that all the royal icing pieces are piped and off drying. And as a reminder, they start looking something like this. The very first stage is going to be to dip them in a tan icing of dipping consistency, which flows gradually off the spoon. And then I'm keeping it covered because it'll dry out really quickly. And I'm dipping them in tan because if you recall this picture, the skinless part of the bulb always has a little bit of ivory color kind of showing out from underneath. And it's smooth, relatively smooth, at least compared to the skin. So I do want to have a couple of textures going on here. So we'll dip first, allow that to dry. Step 2 will be applying the wafer paper skin to the dipped and dry bulbs, which will look something like this. They don't have to be perfect. It'll have some little pinch marks at the end, and that's good. And to apply those skins, we'll be using wafer paper that will be marked with lines using an edible marker. It will then be torn and airbrushed along the edge with a little bit of brown airbrush coloring. And then we'll use a little bit of fabric liquid to loosen it up. That'll smudge some of the coloring and make it look a little more natural. I'll smudge some of those lines we drew so they look a little less distinct. And then we'll stick it all onto the bulb with a little bit of corn syrup. When that's all done, we want to add some roots. And again, those are going to be done with corn silk, which you see in its raw form here. We're going to be kind of lumping it together by rolling it in my palms, but I'm going to make my palms sticky first with a little bit of corn syrup so that rather than disintegrating, the corn silk will get a little bit soft and come together more as a thick thread. So I didn't mention this contraption. This is an old rack from a restaurant for clipping orders onto. You basically need something to drain your bulb from once it's dipped so that it dries with a peak at the bottom. What I'm going to do is put a little trussing needle into the bottom of the bulb, dip it in the icing, and then hang it off the top here. If you don't have a contraption like this, which you very well may not, you can tie a string between two relatively secure objects or a piece of wire, wrap it between two things, and create just a little suspension area for the bulb. So before I can dip that bulb, I need to jam my trussing needle into the end. I'm going to use this trussing needle to hang it onto my dripping rack. Now I'm ready to submerge it into the icing. I really don't want to hit the needle because that'll make it harder to get the bulb off later, but I want to otherwise fully submerge it, lift it up, and allow it to drain. Now most bulbs come to a peak at the top, so I'm going to pinch it here. I don't mind if I drag off a little icing. That'll just make it look a little bit more natural. I want to do that a few times until no more excess is draining off, and then we'll hang it up on my rack here to dry. Now on to making the skins that typically are on the outside of flower bulbs. I'm going to use wafer paper here, starting first by drawing some parallel lines using a thin brown food grade edible marker. Now I'm going to decal the edges of the paper by tearing it using a ruler as a guide. This is just going to make a more natural looking edge to the skin, and I need a bunch of those. So we're going to do a bunch, set them aside, and now I'm ready to give them a little bit more color by airbrushing the torn edges with a little bit of brown. If a little bit of that brown gets in the center of the paper, that's fine too. That's just going to make a more natural looking skin. Once again, I'm going to airbrush up several of these so I have a selection to use when I apply them to the dry bulb. Now, wafer paper is very brittle to start, so to conform it to the bulb, I need to spritz it with a wafer paper conditioner. Here I'm using fabric liquid, which is water and a little bit of sugar, which will make it a touch more sticky and make it easier to apply to the bulb. Now the bulb here is completely dry, the icing on it. I've already wrapped a few pieces of paper on it, so I'm just going to continue to layer more paper on top of the other ones rather randomly until that paper goes all the way around. Now sometimes the fabric liquid isn't enough, so I have to stick additionally with a little bit of corn syrup as I'm doing here at the bottom of the bulb to get it to stick around the curve of the bulb. Now my bulb is looking a little white in areas now that it's fully wrapped, so I'm just going to hit it with a little bit more brown food coloring at a distance so it's just shaded. You can leave it as light or as dark as you want, but I just want it looking a little bit more earthy. Now onto the corn silk, which will form the roots. Corn silk is edible. Make sure you use something that's natural and not treated. It's quite brittle as well to start, so I'm going to soften it by rolling it on some corn syrup on my hand, or we'll try some fabric liquid. That could work too. I just want to get it pliable enough that I can form it into thicker strands that look more root-like, and that looks really pretty nice. So I'm going to simply attach 1 or 2 of those to the bottom of the bulb to look like roots. Maybe apply a few little threads as well, but I'd like to have a few anchor larger root pieces at the base of each bulb. I'm using brown icing to attach it here so it's less likely to show. Here are some other finished ones. I made the mistake of using white icing on that one so it shows a little bit, but hopefully it won't in the final construction. The beauty of this project is all those elements that I spent a lot of time making can be made way ahead, stored in airtight containers, and then pulled out as you want to decorate your fresh cookies. So, while this is definitely labor intensive, there are ways to stage it to make the process more easy on you in the kitchen. I'm now ready to decorate the background of the cookie, and as a reminder, my inspiration here was something that looked like maybe the torn pages out of a garden catalog or old botanical prints. The backgrounds of these cookies have been rubber stamped. The plants are all rubber stamps. And I've come in with compressed petal dust to add some color to those stamped elements and then airbrush the edges with both brown and blue just to create a little bit of a shadow effect. Now, let's talk a little bit about rubber stamping. I have another video that talks about this in great detail, but I just want to remind you of different types of stamps and what to look for when rubber stamping. One challenge with these cookies that are long, and as they dry, they tend to curl. And if the cookie is curled, it's going to make it harder for the stamp, especially a long stamp, to make even contact with the surface of the icing. So to prevent curling from happening as my base white icing is drying, I often ice the cookie onto a cardboard. That's why you see those blobs of icing there. That'll prevent it from curling up as the base icing dries. Even so, over time, they can curl. This one's got a little arc to it. I don't know if you can see. So I might have a little bit of a challenge rubber stamping this one, but we'll see. Now, rubber stamping is done much the same way you'd rubber stamp on paper. And in fact, I suggest you always try your stamps on paper first with food coloring, because if they work on paper, they're going to work on cookies. If they don't work on paper with food coloring, they're not going to work on cookies. Now, let's talk about what kinds of stamps work and don't work. But first, how do I apply the coloring? I use liquid gel coloring, which is what I normally use to color my royal icing. Some people use airbrush coloring, but it's so liquid, I find it skids around a little bit, and I typically end up with a more smudgy imprint. So I like to apply liquid gel coloring to a foam pad. This previously had nothing on it, and it's now brown because I've applied brown food coloring to it before. So I'll apply the food coloring rather generously to start. I don't want it to be pulled up though, and I'll just spread it around to moisten the pad and take off all the excess, and that'll be good for a few prints. Now, different types of stamps. You can find wood-mounted ones. You can find self-adhesive ones that mount to acrylic blocks, like so. This is stuck on there. And you'll notice that these surfaces are either red rubber or kind of an opaque rubber material. These types of stamps almost always take well to food coloring. It clings to it uniformly and gives a nice clean imprint. This stamp, which is also self-adhesive, is clear. And these types of stamps are a little more tricky. Sometimes the food coloring is repelled off this type of stamp and you'll get kind of a beaded look or a discontinuous look to your imprint. And again, that's why I suggest doing it on paper first, because if you get a clean imprint on paper with food coloring, it's likely to work well on the cookie. So that's exactly what I did here. And as it turns out, even though this is a clear stamp, this one did really well on paper. But this is a little trickier one. There's a lot more detail to it. It requires much more uniform application of coloring and more uniform application of pressure. If there's any divot, as I mentioned, in the icing, and this doesn't make contact, you're going to lose a lot of detail, and it's going to be hard to get that detail back into place. On a less involved stamp like this one, which is this flower here, if I miss part of the impression, I can come in with a paintbrush and kind of connect the lines. It'd be a lot harder to do on that one. So for the sake of this video, I'm going to start with some easy stamps. I'll probably just use this one to the side of the cookie. I want to leave room for the snowdrops to be the focal point on the other side. So this is a pretty big stamp, so I like to apply the coloring with the stamp facing up. That way I can make sure I've got even coverage without having to flip the stamp over and over again. I'm putting it off to the side, as I said, to leave room for the snowdrop to the right, and make sure you apply even pressure everywhere, especially in the center of the cookie where the icing dips, so it makes good contact. Interestingly, it made poor contact here along the edge, so I'm going to fill in with a little bit of food coloring using the liner brush, Once that's all dry, which should be instantaneous if I didn't over apply the brown coloring, I'm going to dust some color. I'm using a dusting technique, which is dry compressed petal dust, a dry brush on a dry cookie, and just smudging it into the cookie to give it a suggestion of color. I'm using some yellow on the flower, pink in the center, and some light green along the stems, and brushing off any excess with another dry but unused paintbrush. That looks great. We're ready to shade the edges. I'm going to do a little bit of brown airbrush coloring at the bottom and blue at the top to simulate sky. I'm spraying at a distance here so I just get a subtle suggestion of color. That looks great. So we're on to the final fun assembly part. And this is just to give you an indication of where we're headed. I've got some simple 2-flower cookies in front of me that are about the size of the cookie that I just airbrushed. And I've got some more complex ones with still 2 flowers, but they're bigger and they have a little more going on with them. More rubber stamps, some wafer paper elements, etc. Those are in the foreground and you'll see them scrolling overhead. So you've got a lot of design flexibility with this, because the pieces have been made in isolation, so I can configure them any which way on the cookie once I'm settled on how I like the configuration, then airbrush them if they need additional coloring, which most of them do, and commit them to the cookie with a little bit of royal icing glue. I want to start by airbrushing any pieces that haven't been airbrushed, and usually I like to do a surplus of these so I have a different assortment from which to choose as I assemble on the cookie. Here I'm just hitting the light leaves with a little bit of avocado green, again shading at a distance. You can wear gloves if you don't want to get your hands in the field. Now I've got a selection of leaves here and I've also airbrushed these larger leaves. So I'm going to start first off usually by arranging pieces on the cookie before I commit anything to the cookie with icing glue. But I've got a design here I rather like, so I'm going to start by gluing down my big parts, the bulb and that big leaf. They usually serve as anchor pieces, and then I can nestle smaller things around them. Now, to get this stem down for the snowdrop, I do want to elevate it a touch off the cookie so that the snowdrop will make contact with the top part of the stem. And to do that, I'm going to tuck a little bit of fondant underneath. So I put a little bit of icing down, put a little fondant on top, put a little icing on top of that, and now you can see the stem rises ever so slightly over the top of the cookie so that the stemlet here will make nice contact with it. Now I'm not going to actually glue the stemlet to the stem. I'm going to just glue the base of the flower to the cookie so that the stemlet makes contact with the top of the stem, as you can see here. Now on to other leaves, just sticking them down with a minimum of icing. Again, less is more. I'm working with white here because if I make a mistake, I can clean it off and it's less likely to show. But it can be very visible against some of the green leaves, as you can see down here at the bottom. So in the end construction, I want to make sure all that white icing is covered either with other leaves or with some stray pieces of bulb paper, some loose pieces of the paper that might have been on the flower bulb. All of that's good concealer material. Again, with the snowdrop, I'm anchoring it under the white part of the flower just so that the top of the stemlet makes contact with the stem. I don't want to put a blob of white icing naturally against those 2 green parts of the stem. And that looks pretty good. I'm not quite where I want to be in terms of covering the white icing at the bottom, so let me put another piece of paper here and maybe a little bit more corn silk as well. Getting that paper to stick to the icing is sometimes challenging, but that looks pretty good. And ta-da, I've got this nearly arranged to my satisfaction. These projects are clearly a labor of love with all the individual piecework involved, but they're so darn lifelike and dimensional that I just couldn't resist sharing it with you. I've got a few more things I want to finesse. Namely, this stem needs to make better contact with that snowdrop, and I might swap in a different leaf here that arcs more to the right, but is 99% done. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please stay tuned for the next one in my series, which is going to be a spring dogwood. Till next video, live sweetly.